What is up, everybody? I'm No Lux Given here with your afternoon snap, and today we're going to be taking a look at the Sacred Timeline. Both the location, Sacred Timeline, but also we're traveling back to the past a little bit. These are going to be games before the recent balance patch, actually games before I even hit Galactic this month. So kind of old games, but felt they would be fun to look at because I never really looked at Sacred Timeline, never really even cared about the location, because when it came out last season, I was just playing only Galactus, which doesn't really care about whatever the Sacred Timeline is doing, so haven't really gotten a chance to explore the location myself. Now, the location itself was also changed in the recent balance patch. I'll talk about that in the second game of this video. But in the first one, we're just going to see a pretty straightforward timeline game. And one of the things that's really interesting about the timeline, it's very similar to the raft in that you get a reward for filling up the location, though I think that the reward is probably worse than a free 6-cost card. So people are a little bit hesitant to fill the timeline, I've noticed, because if you fill it up, then your opponent can easily take it from you in those final turns. And that's definitely a risk, but I think this deck has enough interesting tools to win if you are able to grab a win in the timeline. So that is what I'm basically going to go for. We can see that my opponent could have played the Maria Hill and the Iceman into the timeline to be able to win it, and they would have still been able to add additional power there with Sunspot, so it wouldn't have been a crazy play by any means, but I'm just going to go for the Sacred Timeline here and hope then that with an additional copy of Red Skull, I will be able to win the other two locations. And it will actually be very, very important, as you'll see in just a second. So my opponent is going to snap on this turn, but I'm going to stay in it. We'll see what they got. We throw Sunspot into the Sacred Timeline, and then my opponent has a She-Hulk for Lechugia. So we are now totally bunked in the Sacred Timeline. My opponent can probably win that quite easily, despite the fact that we're winning there by 5 and can still add power to Sunspot. It's going to be tough. We do have Arrow, which can potentially make some nice things happen. This is pre-nerf Arrow, so if my opponent doesn't play to the timeline this turn, then we could potentially use Arrow to make all of them play into Lechugia on the final turn of the game to be able to grab a win. So that is definitely part of the plan. If my opponent plays to Central Park here this turn, that's actually probably the best for me because they're not going to beat Red Skull, and then on the final turn I can Arrow them into Lechugia and then just Titania into Central Park to just grab a little bit of additional power there as well. However, my opponent has Leech, so we're not going to see Arrow in action, but this does mean that my opponent has leached my second copy of Red Skull, which means that now I can potentially swing Lechugia back in my favor. And that was the other thing that I was talking about with Sacred Timeline, is just using it to win the other two locations, though just using Arrow to kind of like control the lanes also makes some sense. We can see my opponent is going to take over the Sacred Timeline. They commit a full Hulk there, and that means they don't have enough power to also attempt to win Lechugia, and I'm able to win in the other two. This second game will make use of something that no longer works with Sacred Timeline, but I still wanted to show it off and then I can kind of talk about the change. But what had happened when you were to change cards that you put into the Sacred Timeline, as you'll see that we do here with Titania. I'm going to zero this Titania that came from our opening hand to make it lose all abilities. And then when I get a Titania later on from the Sacred Timeline, that Titania is also going to have no abilities, but that's not how it works anymore. Now you will just get a base copy of the cards that are added from your opening hand, which honestly makes a lot more sense. You're getting cards from that old timeline, so they should look how they looked in the original timeline. So you don't really have to worry about that. I just wanted to show off a variety of Sacred Timeline games, and in this one, we are just going full send into the timeline. I'm going to have 19 power there this turn, plus a Sunspot to potentially even put more power in there. So that is looking really, really good. It'll be tough. My opponent will have to commit a lot to take over that location. But the other thing here that's kind of crazy is now I have a second copy of pre-nerf Arrow, which is obviously just fantastic and made even more powerful by the fact that one of these locations is Fisk Tower. So if my opponent tries to play to any location other than the Fisk Tower, then we will say, no, you don't, get in here, and we'll blow up their cards. So obviously that is just a lot of pressure. They're going to have to fill the Fisk Tower before they can even attempt to try to win in the other locations, which is going to make things pretty tough for them here. So my opponent reveals a Serra, so they might be able to play a bunch of cards next turn. That's pretty good for them. However, if you notice, that Serra was actually flipped. It's got 5 power, which means that Mr. Negative got in there, and that means my opponent has actually only drawn 1 real card from Mr. Negative, which is just going to make it really tough for them to try to find a win in 2 different locations, let alone even just 1, potentially, because if they try to play anywhere else, we're just going to drag them into the Fisk Tower. So yeah, they're kind of in a tough position here. They're going to just wind up retreating, but I just wanted to show off another cool example of a Fisk Tower game and give one final send-off to this pre-patch Shuri deck. I still think that this Shuri deck is really, really good. I still think that Arrow is stronger. The deck might even just be, or not stronger, Arrow is just strong, but the deck might even be stronger now, because this deck was actually somewhat impacted. You can see that by Arrow. You can see that in our hand we've got She-Hulk, Taskmaster, and Shuri, which is a really, really good combo. Turn 4 Shuri, turn 5 Skip, turn 6 She-Hulk plus Taskmaster, but that plan was really interrupted with Arrow in the metagame. And now if we're going to see less arrows, then that might make this deck even better, potentially. We'll see how that all goes in the future, but for today, that's it for this timeline. Thank you guys very much for watching. I'm No Lux Given. Peace.